Otra de las cosas bonitas que sucede por acá es cuando te empiezas a reunir también con otras personas, empiezas a conocer otras personas y te vienes a disfrutar acá de un rico menudo. Acá está la masa y están echando aquí las tortillas, mira cómo están echando aquí las tortillas. Recién hechecitas, ¿eh? ¿Qué tal? Mira nomás. Y ahorita estas tortillas acompañadas con un menú que nos vamos a echar que según dice que preparó aquel joven de allá. Lo hizo
¿Unas mentiras yo?
¿Tú, mera?
Sí.
Ahí está. Ahorita te lo voy a decir a pinche Ramiro. A ver, pinche Ramiro, a ver si es cierto que tú hiciste el menudo, cabrón. Así es de que ahorita nos vamos a echar y acá también un celito echando gorditas.
El menudo, mira. Yo dije, Pepe no me saluda, pero yo me voy a poner esta tortilla para que me salude.
¿Cómo estás, Celita?
Bien contento porque están ya aquí de vuelta.
Ay, gracias. Sí, afortunadamente ya estamos de
Gracias a Dios.
de retorno.
Ya volví a la fiesta.
Bien,
Ya vi a mi juvenilizar un ratito.
vámonos, mira. Ay, joder, mi corazón. Mira nomás qué chulada. Menudito huele. Que no saben cómo está este pedo. Pero bueno, ya contento, a gusto de haber disfrutado en Corcoran, California y estar pues con toda la gente linda y regresar a esta que es mi casa. Ya la voy a vender. Ya nomás que me entreguen las escrituras y las voy a vender. ¿Verdad, güey? Que tú dijiste que esta es mi casa,
Sí.
¿verdad, güey? Sí. Nomás, entrégame las escrituras cuando deja mañana, güey.
La vendes, no, güey.
A ver, ¿quién preparó el menudo, güey?
Yo. ¿Quién fue?
No, pues es maravilloso estar con gente tan linda y gracias por su hospitalidad, Rosy.
Ya saben, cuando
Ramiro,
gusten,
gracias.
aquí está su casa.
Excelente, ya saben, aquí en Terravela se la paso a todo dar y pues vamos a comer mejor. Gracias. Bueno, continuamos porque hay que comer. ¿Cómo están? Bueno, pues hoy en esta ocasión nos encontramos hasta acá del otro lado. Me encuentro ahora acá en Aurora, Illinois. Y pues el día de hoy te voy a llevar a conocer un poquito más de Chicago, a dar un recorrido por la ciudad de los vientos. La temperatura está bastante agradable a diferencia de México. No tanto como el de aquí, porque luego aquí es muy... llueve mucho y está muy escandaloso acá por el asunto cuando llueve, ¿no? Pero sí, la temperatura sí está agradable. El día de ayer estuvo haciendo un poco de calor, no igual que está haciendo en México ahorita en este instante, o en el instante que estoy grabando este video. Acompáñenos a esta aventura por Chicago, por la ciudad de los vientos, y a veces sí se siente, pues está nubladón. El día de ayer estaba hermoso, estaba el día bastante soleado. Entonces pues vamos a ver qué encontramos el día de hoy en esta aventura por la ciudad de los vientos, Chicago, desde aquí desde Aurora, Illinois. Te mando un gran saludo y pues vamos, acompáñanos a ver esta gran aventura. Vámonos. a Chicago. Esta es la famosísima ciudad de los vientos. Pues vamos a ver algunos atractivos turísticos el día de hoy. Está la temperatura agradable, el cielo está nublado, estuvo lloviendo y todo el asunto, pero aún así pues eso no nos va a detener, así es de que vamos a ver qué tal aquí la ciudad de los vientos, Chicago, Illinois. Acompáñame. Navy Pier, uno de los lugares atractivos turísticos más importantes de esta gran ciudad de los vientos. Como les comentaba hace un momentito, yo creo que es una de las la temperatura está súper agradable, entre fresco, calientito. El asunto está todo muy bien para cuando tengan la oportunidad de venir visitar este lugar. Aquí puedes hacer muchísimo turismo, paseo en el lago Michigan, que lo tenemos acá a un costado, un lago muy grande, muy bonito. Temporada de verano, que casi estamos llegando a la temporada de verano, yo creo que es uno de los lugares que sí debes de visitar. Por ejemplo, todo lo que se llama el shoreline sign, que es puedes ver todo el atractivo, que te voy a llevar a dar una vuelta precisamente para que veas cómo está todo este merequetengue, todo este asunto aquí en esta ciudad de los vientos. Mira nada más qué chulada. Digo, para la gente, a lo mejor otra gente prefiere lugares turísticos más con más ciudad, por ejemplo acá. Otros prefieren lugares turísticos con más naturaleza, a lo mejor más vegetación, más árboles, más todo. Pero si estás por acá y que tienes la oportunidad de visitar acá Chicago, pues yo creo que estos son los lugares sin duda tienes que venir a visitar. Aquí el famoso Navy Pier, pues vamos a darnos una vuelta por el bote para enseñarte.
¡Diablos, señorita!
Qué bonito es esta ciudad. Pues mucha gente que viene a visitar año con año a este lugar, que se sube a estos botes para ver lo que es el shoreline, que es toda la parte como de la costa de este gran lago. Y ya un lago tan grande como es el lago Michigan, pues sí tiene playas, tiene lugares muy padres. Entonces vamos a hacer este tour, así es de que acompáñanos. Vengo bien acompañado de familia, y pues vamos a ver qué nos ofrece este paseo en bote. ¿Qué fue? Que en estos tours hay diferentes. Te puedes ir el tour arquitectónico, que te muestra te lleva por todo el río, que creo que es el que vamos a tomar, ¿no? El arquitectónico. Creo que te lo dan en español también, los tours te los dan en español, en inglés y probablemente en algún otro idioma. Pues vamos a recorrer ese tour por todo lo que es el lago Michigan, al interior de Chicago, cómo corre al interior de Chicago. Ya nos está medio chispeando. Para volver a ver más.
Plan to reverse the direction of the entire river. We dug a series of canals to the south and west that connected to the Swain River, which connects to the Illinois River, which connects to the Mississippi River, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It took 3 years of planning, of digging. The Army Corps of Engineers helped out. They had to go across a continental divide, and they moved more dirt than they moved for the Panama Canal. In the year 1900, we successfully completed our project to reverse the direction of the Chicago River, so today it flows out of Lake Michigan through the city, in the direction we'll be heading shortly. Now, on average, Lake Michigan, over here to our left, is about 4 feet higher than the Chicago River. And the way they account for that difference is by what's called locks, 2 sets of boat doors that control the flow of water and boats from the lake to the river. They also closely monitor those locks to make sure no invasive species get in or out. In recent years, Lake Michigan has had an invasive species called zebra mussels. It's a type of mollusk. It's been filtering the water. It's actually changed the color of Lake Michigan. On a sunny day, you can see better how it's a light blue, kind of tropical color. That's because of those zebra mussels. And by extension, they've also changed the color of the main branch of the Chicago River, what we're on right now, because this is water flowing out of Lake Michigan. As we come around the bend here, off to your left, look for what looks like a short air control tower. Just to the right of that are the locks, those 2 sets of boat doors. That's how we control the flow of water and boats from Lake Michigan onto the Chicago River. This cute little house behind the red boats there, that's for police and fire boats. As you can see, there's a bunch of sailboats that park right here as well. As we hang a right onto the main branch of the Chicago River, we're going to go under this first bridge on DuSable Lakeshore Drive. Chicago has a lot of these. We actually have the second most movable bridges of any city in the world. Amsterdam being number 1, and by a movable bridge, I mean they can raise. Most of them are what's called double leaf bridges, meaning either side can lift up, like the one in front of us. They still do raise the bridges from time to time, mostly in the late spring to allow sailboats to get out to the lake. They do it at scheduled times on Wednesday and Saturday mornings in sort of a group flotilla. So if you're ever hanging out downtown and you see a group of sailboats just kind of waiting around, they're probably waiting for one of these bridges to raise. If you ever get a chance to watch a bridge lift, I highly recommend it. It is a very impressive sight, watching our movable bridges move. DuSable Lakeshore Drive is a very scenic drive that runs down the edge of Lake Michigan. It's been a long-term priority for the city to make sure the river is public access, or the lakefront rather, is public access, so it's a lot of parks and beaches along Lake Michigan. And once we get out from underneath this loud bridge, we'll start talking skyscrapers. While we're underway, feel free to take as many pictures as you like. We just ask you mostly take pictures from your seat, so you're not blocking anyone's view standing up. Near the end of the tour, we get back out to the spot. We'll take a nice long photo break where everyone can stand up and take some group photos near the end of the tour. And we'll finish up the tour at the same place where we started. The tour is about 75 minutes. Everybody wave to my cousin. Ew. Chicago. We'll start over on the left. That 3-level blue glass skyscraper is the St. Regis 2020. St. Regis is the 3rd tallest building in Chicago and the tallest building in the world, designed by a woman-led architecture firm. Studio Gang, led by Chicagoland architect Jeannie Gang, designed the St. Regis. Did you know skyscrapers are actually designed to sway in the breeze? It's true, you don't want them to be too rigid, but you also don't want them to sway too much. So in this tour, I'm going to tell you about 3 methods of sway reduction, how we calm down skyscrapers swaying in breeze. The first one, if you look at the tallest out of those 3 towers, on the 83rd and 84th floor, there's a gap. That's a cool picture. You see the sun through the clouds there? And that gap is called a blow-through floor. The idea is wind can take a shortcut through that gap, take some of the pressure off the tallest part of the building. That blow-through floor was actually not in the original plans for the building. Right around the time they started construction, they did some more small-scale tests. They realized their math was off, and they needed more help with the wind. So they just never built floors 83 and 84, which is a bummer for the developers, because many of those other floors sold for millions of dollars as high-end apartments. One of the penthouse units, the top 2 floors, that middle tower, sold for about $20 million. One of the biggest sales in Chicago's history, and I'm pretty happy with my purchase. The St. Regis is made with 6 different shades of blue glass, meant to imitate how the water and the sky look different under different light conditions. That blue glass gets darker where the building gets narrower, and lighter where the building gets wider. It actually stands out better against a cloudy background, so that's nice for today. It's got a wavy shape to it, a very unique shape for a skyscraper. Kind of fits with their aquatic motif, referring to the Chicago River and Lake Michigan nearby. The St. Regis is luxury apartments on the top with a luxury hotel on the bottom. Like I said, they finished the exterior of the building in 2020, but that hotel on the bottom had a few setbacks due to the pandemic and some ownership changes. So that hotel just opened for the first time last summer. Rooms started around $700 a night. St. Regis, 3rd tallest building in Chicago, tallest building in the world, designed by a woman. Now ahead on the left, you'll see a silvery building sticking out at an angle. We're going to look behind that. In the second row, look for a building with wavy white balconies. Aqua Tower from 2009 was designed by Jeannie Gang, same architect who did the St. Regis. That is the previous record holder for tallest building in the world, designed by a woman, same woman, Jeannie Gang. Those wavy white balconies are meant to imitate eroded limestone outcroppings in the Great Lakes area. If you go to Starved Rock State Park, a couple hours west of here, you'll see rock formations that look a lot like those balconies. And then in the back row, beyond that, you'll see the top corner of a white skyscraper with straight up and down vertical lines, the Aeon Center, formerly known as Big Stan for Standard Oil. We're going to get a better view of that white skyscraper in the back row once we get around this brown building, the James Hardie. But on the way there, I want to tell you a story about the Aeon Center, because it has a bit of a troubled past. When it was completed in 1973, it was the tallest building in Chicago for 1 year. Then they finished the Sears Tower. So that was a bummer. Also, they originally covered the outside of the building with rare Italian marble. Same type of marble that Michelangelo had used to make the statue of David. But that rare marble could not handle Chicago winters. It started to crack and fall off. So they had to strip all that marble off and replace it with granite from North Carolina. That process cost half as much as the entire building did in the first place. Today, the Aeon Center is the 4th tallest building in Chicago. You'll see it coming into view on your left. I can see it now. Look for the white skyscraper in the back row. With the straight up and down vertical lines, the Aeon Center, 4th tallest building in Chicago, and formerly the tallest marble-clad building in the world. Now, one of my favorite fun facts is about a building coming up on your right. Off in the distance, look for a building with a round yellow dome. The Intercontinental Hotel, built by the Shriners. You know, the guys that wear the Fez hats, like Middle Eastern themes, they put a dome on top of what was originally their athletic association. My favorite fact about that building, you see that little stone tower poking up behind the yellow dome? That was originally intended as a place to dock your blimp. They thought in the future we'd all be taking a rigid airship to work, or a Zeppelin, so they made a parking spot for blimps. Unfortunately, a blimp has never parked there. Right after they built that, the Hindenburg disaster happened, an infamous blimp explosion, and blimps got a lot less popular. Ahead on your right, that white clock tower is the Wrigley Building. When it was completed in 1924, that was the tallest building in Chicago. It's an architectural style called Spanish Revival. At that time in the early 20s, American architects were still trying to figure out their own unique style, so we're still copying European styles. Specifically, that clock tower is modeled after a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain called La Giralda. So it's an office building made to look like a cathedral. If you're a baseball fan, you might recognize the name Wrigley. Wrigley Field, where the Chicago Cubs play, is named for the same company. This is originally their offices. The Wrigley Company started off as a soap and baking powder company, and then one time they did a promotion where they included a free stick of chewing gum with every purchase. The gum was so popular, they just became a chewing gum company. This was their original offices. Today there's a Lou Malnati's deep dish pizza joint there, as well as a Ghirardelli's if you're looking for some good chocolate. The bottom of the Wrigley Building is a darker shade of gray, and as you work your way up that clock tower, there's fewer and fewer dark gray pixels. It gets lighter as you go up. That's intentional. The idea is to draw your eye upwards. The way they did that is the outside of the Wrigley Building is tiled. It's covered in more than 250,000 enameled terracotta tiles, which gives it that lovely color gradient, getting lighter as you go up, drawing your eye up. And those tiles also make the Wrigley Building more fireproof. Fire is, unfortunately, a big part of Chicago's history. We'll talk more about the Great Chicago Fire later on. One disadvantage to those tiles is they're too delicate to be power washed, so once a year, all 250,000 tiles have to be scrubbed by hand. After this bridge, we're going to take a look at the 2nd tallest building in Chicago. Straight ahead, the Trump International Hotel and Tower, 2009. Trump Tower, 2nd tallest building in Chicago. You'll see it has 3 horizontal black strips going across it at places where the building gets narrower. Every time the building gets narrower, that's called a setback, and their heights are no coincidence. That lowest setback is the same height as the roof of the Wrigley Building. It's 2009, saying hello to 1924. It's a great example of a modern style called contextualism, as in context, ways for buildings to flow with the context around them. In this case, the height of each of those 3 setbacks corresponds to the height of a different older building nearby. Trump Tower was designed by another Chicago architect, Adrian Smith, also known as the world's tallest architect because he designed the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. To help picture the tallest building in the world, picture 2 of Trump Towers stacked on top of each other. About twice the height of Trump Tower. That's about the height of the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, designed by the same architect, Adrian Smith, right here in Chicago. Ahead on the left, you'll see a stone building with short towers on the corners and a round dome in the middle. The Jewelers Building, when it was completed in 1926, was the tallest building west of New York City. There used to be a lot of jewelry companies in there. In the 20s, those were Al Capone's days. A lot of organized crime. So if a jeweler was worried about getting robbed, they did not have to leave their car because the Jewelers Building had an automobile elevator. You could drive your car with your jewelry into the building and take you, your vehicle, and your jewelry up to any of the first 27 floors. Also, have you seen the movie Batman Begins? I recognize those corner towers. Batman spent some time in front of one of those corner towers, brooding, doing Batman stuff. Coming up on your right, 2 of the most photographed buildings on the river. Look for 2 round, white, sort of corncob or honeycomb-shaped towers. The Marina City Towers, 1968. Their architect Bertrand Goldberg said there are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature, therefore our buildings should have none. Once you get this very round, natural design. Goldberg's goal was to create a city within a city. You could live in your apartment above, park your car in the garage below, dine in the restaurants below that. There was an ice skating rink, a bowling alley. Today the House of Blues is in there, a music venue. You could even park your boat in the marina underneath. At the time these were built in the 1960s, the river was still very industrial. A lot more factories, smelly. Not a lot of people wanted to live right by the river. So since these were some of the first big residential buildings on the river, they had to include anything its residents could possibly want. A city within a city. See the cars on the parking garage on the bottom there? You have to be a professional valet to park there. They don't let just anyone back up to the ledge. I actually got to go to a New Year's Eve party in one of those towers, and on New Year's, there's barges on the river that shoot off fireworks, so I got to watch fireworks going off while I was above them. It's pretty cool. Probably the best thing I got out of that relationship. Yeah, there's gonna be jokes. On your left, that short concrete building with the gold 5-5 is 55 West Wacker, also from 1968, but a very different style called brutalism, or architecture in the raw. The late 60s were a tumultuous time, and certain businesses and institutions wanted to convey a sense of stability. So they built these heavy fortress-like buildings with exposed concrete and small inset windows. Brutalism is a style that came and went pretty quickly in the late 60s. It's a style you'll see in a lot of government buildings, university campuses, and libraries. Now for contrast that heavy fortress, the next one on the left is an elegant glass skyscraper. We're going to follow these white granite columns all the way up to the roof. You'll see the roof looks like an ancient Greek temple. Kind of looks like the Parthenon in Athens, stretched out to a glass skyscraper. This is 77 West Wacker, a style called neoclassical. It's a new take on classical ancient Greek design. It's pretty cool from a time perspective. We're here in 2024, looking at a building from 1992, which is itself a reference all the way back to ancient Greece. Like I said, feel free to take as many pictures as you like. I'll be sure to try to point out if I see any extra special photo opportunities. A lot of nice riverfront restaurants here if you want to make plans for later. All along next to us on the left, you see folks enjoying the Chicago River Walk, built in the early 2000s at a cost of $112 million. Now each section of the river walk between the various sets of bridges is called a room. Each room has its own unique style. The room to our left right now is known as the River Theater, named for those steps like you'd have in an ancient amphitheater. It's pretty cool how they have the trees going right under the steps right there. The idea of having a river walk on the Chicago River dates back to 1909. It's part of a long-term plan for the whole city called the Burnham Plan by an architect named Daniel Burnham. That plan is also a big part of the reason we have our lovely public access lakefront. Like I said, all those parks and beaches along Lake Michigan. Another great feature of the Burnham Plan. A plan we made for the whole city all the way back in 1909. We'll talk more about Daniel Burnham and his plan later on the tour. On the next bridge, the Wells Street Bridge, you can see one of our public transit CTA trains, also known as the L train, short for elevated train, EL, not the letter L, because they're often elevated above the street. The next wide stone building on the left is called the Builders Building. This one is built in two sections. The wide section on the left with all the stripy pillars near the bottom is from 1927, and the narrow section on the right with the dark bay windows that stick out was added on in 1986. That's a nearly 60-year time jump, all within one building, the Builders Building. This next bridge, the Wells Street Bridge, was originally built in the 1920s and then replaced with an exact replica in 2013. So it looks like one of our historic bridges, but it's actually relatively new. We talked about how in the early 1920s, American architects were still trying to figure out their own unique style. Well, in the late 1920s, the Roaring 20s, they found their own unique American style called Art Deco. When you hear Art Deco, think Roaring 20s. Great example of Art Deco is this next huge stone building on your right. From 1929, the Merchandise Mart. This Art Deco style is all about optimism in our machine-made future. You get that sense of optimism from all the straight line columns on the way up, just like we felt we were on the way up. And there's a machine feeling to it, a lot of repetitive patterns, like the arrows in the trim, the gold squares at regular intervals, feels like something off of an assembly line. Closer to the river, there's a row of statue heads. Those were added in 1953 by Joseph Kennedy, father of former President John F. Kennedy. The Kennedys owned the Merchandise Mart for many years. Those 8 bronze busts are what's called the Merchant Princes, big Chicago businessmen who shaped the city's history, including the founders of Sears and also Marshall Field, for whom the Field Museum of Natural History is named. We'll talk more about the Merchandise Mart on the way back, how big it is, what they used it for. But for now, eyes up, cameras up. After this bridge, you're gonna have one of your best views on the tour. We're We're approaching the junction of the three branches of the Chicago River. A lot of our newest skyscrapers have been built at this junction. If you took a tour 10 or 15 years ago, you would have been looking at a lot more parking lots. Today you're looking at Chicago's trophy case. Welcome to Wolf Point. If I'm in the front of your picture, I'll try to make it look like I was really guiding it up. This is Wolf Point, the junction of the three branches of the Chicago River. We're leaving the main branch. We'll do a quick excursion up the north branch to our right. Then we'll head way down the south branch and see the Willis Tower on the way back. Straight ahead is a building with a big arch at the bottom. River Point from 2017 has a similar arch swooping down at the top. Some people call this the Hot Pocket Building. River Point's built directly above active Amtrak and Metro train lines. If you look at the stone wall below it, straight ahead, there's circles in that stone wall. Those are vents. There's fans spinning in there, letting air out from the trains to run right underneath River Point. Like I said, a lot of our newest skyscrapers have been built here at Wolf Point. The newest addition to our skyline is directly to your right, Wolf Point South, also known as Salesforce Tower. It's a brand new office building they just built in the last few years. As we come around the bend, to the left of that, there's a greenish building, Wolf Point West, an apartment building from 2016. 10 years ago, this spot was a parking lot. These just shot up pretty recently. Now, most of the buildings we'll look at today are either apartment or office buildings. I'll give you a little trick to help tell the difference. If you happen to see any windows cracked open or balconies, it's probably an apartment building. If there are no windows cracked open or balconies, it's probably an office building. Straight ahead of the boat now, on the left side, that shorter brick peach-colored building is the oldest building we'll talk about on the river today. The Fulton House is from 1898. It was originally a freezer for the meatpacking industry. Chicago was a big hub for the meatpacking industry. They'd slaughter cattle in the stockyards around the city, bring them here to be frozen and shipped off on trains. Then in the 1970s, an architect named Harry Weiss oversaw a redesign and turned them into apartments. They put a bunch of holes into it for windows and balconies. Take a look at those balconies on the far left side of that brick building. See the white space on the outside of those balconies? Shows you just how thick the walls of that freezer were. They say when the meatpacking industry moved out in the 1970s, it took the Fulton House 3 months to thaw out. And when they hollowed out those 4-foot thick walls, they found they'd been insulated with a mixture of cork and horsehair. Straight ahead now, this bridge sticking up in the air is the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge, 1908. This bridge is a landmark. It's no longer in use, but it gives us a nice demonstration of how these movable bridges work. Like I said, by a movable bridge, I mean they can raise. The technical term for this type of bridge is a trunnion bascule bridge, fancy word for seesaw or teeter-totter. On the back of the bridge, see the big concrete block? That's the counterweight. When the block goes down, the bridge stands up. All 37 of our movable bridges have counterweights like that. Most of them are buried out of sight where you can't see them, but the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge from 1908 is kind enough to demonstrate. Like I said, this bridge is a landmark, no longer in use. Obviously, there's no railroad here anymore. The railroad that used to be here actually ran all the way out to Navy Pier, where we started the tour and where we'll end up at the end. On your left, these pointy residences are the River Cottages, 1988, designed by Harry Weiss, same architect who redesigned the Fulton House. He was a big fan of sailing and triangles. The whole building is shaped like a sail. No circular windows like the portholes on a ship. Everyone thought Harry Weiss was crazy for this one, not just for the odd triangular shape of the building, but for the fact he wanted to put residences on the river at all. As recently as 1988, when these were built, the river was still very industrial, stinky. Not a lot of people wanted to live by the river. In the long term, though, Harry Weiss was right. A few years ago, one of those 4 units, one slice from the bottom to the top there, sold for $2.25 million. The river is now some of the most sought after real estate in the city. So, our Captain Ray is going to do a U-turn. This is a great little break if you need to use the bathrooms at the back of the boat or visit Frank at the bar. My name is Michael. I'll be doing a lap. If you have any questions, need any recommendations, let me know. I'll be back on the mic after we turn around.
Look, otra.
All right, we are back. You've probably heard of the Great Chicago Fire. We'll talk about that later on, but did you know there was also a Great Chicago Flood? Back in 1992, some crews were working on that bridge sticking up in the air, the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge. They were working on the wooden pilings at the base and accidentally put a hole in the wall of a tunnel that they forgot was there. That allowed water from the river to flood into the basements of a bunch of our downtown office buildings. So those tunnels connect all around downtown. There was up to 40 feet of water in some of those basements. Fish were even swimming around in the basement of Merchandise Mart, and it caused almost $2 billion worth of damage. Eyewitnesses said it looked like the bottom of a bath drain right around here, just flooding into our basements. The Great Chicago Flood of 1992. And I can only imagine how confusing it must have been for those fish. This spot in the river is also the original site of the first footbridge we built across the river in the early 1800s, which is built to access a tavern. I gotta admit, it's colder than I thought it was gonna be today. That's why I wore my shortest shorts. We all have regrets. On the right, this curving gray building is the Riverbend Condominiums, 2003. See how the front of that building curves in? If you look ahead to the next glass building on the right, River Point, see how the front of that building curves out? Well, if you're into geometry, it's actually the same radius. Mathematically, the amount the first building curves in is the same amount the next building curves out. It's another great example of contextualism. When they built that glass building, River Point, they acknowledged their context and they curve just like their neighbor. Both buildings are also imitating the curve of the Chicago River as well. Some nice timing on the Lake Street Bridge straight ahead, another one of our CTA or L trains. You might have heard our downtown area referred to as the Loop. That is a reference to our CTA or L trains. They start on the outside, converge in the middle of downtown, do a loop, and then head back out to the respective branches. So it is generally called downtown the Loop. Chicago has pretty good public transportation by American standards, which means it's bad. And as we come around the bend here, off to your left, you're about to have a lovely view of the main branch of the Chicago River. That's facing east in the direction of Lake Michigan. In particular, we get a great view of the St. Regis, that wavy blue skyscraper in the back row. See the gap near the top that I was talking about earlier, the blow-through floor. Great view of that. And in the middle, the Marina City Corn Cob Towers. If you're a fan of the band Wilco, it was one of their album covers. A lot of famous movie stunts have been done driving cars off of there, including by Steve McQueen. And right behind it, the blue skyscraper with the pointy gray spire poking up is Trump Tower, second tallest building in Chicago. So we're leaving the north branch of the Chicago River. We're going to start heading south on the south branch of the Chicago River. Up ahead on your right, you probably saw a building with a Y-shaped foundation. See how it pinches together at the bottom? Now, why would you want to build a foundation like that? It was a tricky spot to put a skyscraper. They had to fit that foundation in between two things. On the one side, there's Amtrak and Metro trains running underneath. On the other side, a city zoning law required them to leave 30 feet of space between the river and the front of the building for public access. The city wants people hanging out by the river. So they had to squeeze that foundation into only 20% of the lot space. The first full-size floor of that building is about 100 feet off the ground. Now, how do you do that safely? A lot of concrete. You ever see those rotating concrete trucks? It took about 500 of those to pour the foundation for this building. It's called 150 North Riverside from 2017. You'll see a lot of that concrete along the foundation on the bottom there. It goes much further down into the ground than we can see here. And also kind of a fun trick, if you look up in the glass underneath, you'll see a reflection of our boat. See if you can spot yourself in the reflection up there. Here's what we're talking about, our second method of sway reduction. Now we calm down skyscrapers swaying in the breeze. Now you won't be able to see them, but on the top floor of this building to your right, there are 12 tanks holding 160,000 gallons of water. Basically, whenever the wind makes the building sway one way, all the water in those tanks on the top floor sloshes the other way. And that helps reduce the amount of time it takes the building to settle. Which is important, because that's an office building, and that can mean the difference between hitting reply and accidentally hitting reply all. Those tanks of water on the top floor is called tuned inertial slosh dampers, referring to the inertia of that water sloshing back and forth, stabilizing our skyscrapers in the Windy City. The next blue glass skyscraper on the left is called the Bank of America building from 2020. This one cost around $800 million to construct. You'll see it's got these blue ridges running up the side. Those help shave off the wind step by step. They also have very reflective glass. Get a really clear view of the sky and its neighbors bouncing off the front face. The Bank of America building had to deal with that same city zoning law requiring them to leave 30 feet of space between the river and the front of the building. You can see how they dealt with that with these tripod legs. Those steel I-beams lift the third floor and beyond up off the ground so that person can sit on a bench and think about their life. Now, like I said earlier, I call my tour a tour of time. So, it's convenient. The next 5 buildings on the right are going to be in chronological order. Let's go through some different phases of Chicago's architectural history. We'll start in the Roaring 20s with another Art Deco building on your right, 2 North Riverside Plaza. Much like the Merchandise Mart, is another Art Deco building from the same year, 1929, made of the same material, polished Indiana limestone. This was originally home to the Chicago Daily News. A lot of famous writers worked in this building, including Carl Sandburg and Joseph Pulitzer. Take a look at those columns along the bottom of the building. In between the tops of those columns, there are carvings. Those bas-reliefs tell the story of the written word, from hieroglyph to the Gutenberg printing press. And speaking of hieroglyphs, on the wall by the river, see those stone obelisks poking up with the white lights around them? This is built right around the time they discovered King Tut's tomb, which caused a craze in American architecture of including Egyptian elements. And so I see those stone obelisks on the wall by the river. So this is Art Deco, fancy style from the Roaring 20s. At the end of the Roaring 20s, we had the Great Depression, and then World War II, and those 20 years or so are kind of a gap in the architectural record. We're not building a lot of new big office buildings. So when we emerge in the post-war period, those world-changing experiences have changed our mindset. And that's how you get a new style called black box modernism. On your right, Gateway 1 from 1965, and Gateway 2 from 1967. Black box modernism is all about simplicity and efficiency. We got rid of the more decorative Art Deco style, now we're just trying to be as efficient as possible. These are people that had lived through the Great Depression. They did not want to waste anything. It's a style pioneered by a German architect, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who led the Bauhaus school in Germany, came here and designed over 40 of Chicago's skyscrapers. Once you start noticing these black box buildings, you'll see them all over town. The most famous example of this style, black box modernism, is also the most famous building in Chicago. You'll see the top corner to your left there, the Willis, formerly Sears Tower. We'll get a much better view of the Willis Tower on the way back, and I'll talk about it for a long time. Mies van der Rohe actually coined the phrase, less is more, all about keeping it simple and efficient. He viewed these office buildings as machines made for working in. Sounds like a fun guy. Each of these black box buildings has 3 basic ingredients: skeleton, skin, and space. The skeleton is the steel frame on the inside that does most of the work holding up the building. The skin is the outside. It's what we call a curtain wall, as opposed to a load-bearing wall. Other buildings might have more stone or brick along the outside, bearing the load of the building. In this case, the steel skeleton on the inside does that, so the outside is more of a covering, what we call a curtain wall. The third ingredient is the space. These can be very serious-looking buildings. One thing that makes them more welcoming is they usually leave space around the outside of the building for an outdoor plaza. As you can see, the plaza for Gateway 2 to our right is currently under construction, getting an upgrade. If you're ever on one of those plazas, the grout lines, the lines in the sidewalk, often line up exactly with the window frames. The next white box ahead on the right is Gateway 3, 1971. So now we're moving along in time. We're getting a little bit more decorative. Now it's not just a steel box. Now we cover the outside with this precast sandy concrete. Gateway 3 is built in what's called the international style. The idea they were going for here is that you can put this building in any city in the world and it would fit in the international style. So we're to Gateway 1, 2, and 3. As you might be able to guess, this next curving glass building ahead on the right is Gateway 4, 1983. So now it's the 1980s. We got big hair bands. We're ready to show off again. We got new materials with which to show off. Now we have the ability to curve our glass, just like the river curves. Another great example of contextualism, building flowing with its context. Also, I just think this is funny. On the right, you got a fitness center right next to a bakery. One is a place I push my body to the limit every morning, and the other one is a fitness center. The next black box building on the left is 300 South Wacker. Now, we actually did not used to talk about this building very much on the tour. It used to be kind of just another black box, one of many we have here in Chicago. That is, until a few years ago, the owners of the building spent $800,000 to put a giant map on the side of the building. About halfway up, you'll see what looks like a red Lego brick. That represents this building. See the shape of the river beside it? The junction of the river above Wolf Point? It's basically a giant "You Are Here" sign. They put themselves on the map by putting a map on themselves. Any fans of Batman? I recognize this next stone building ahead on the right in the movie The Dark Knight. That was Gotham City Bank. The heist at the beginning of The Dark Knight with the school buses was filmed right there. The school buses went along Van Buren Street in front of us, and the Joker and his henchmen took zip lines from that glass building, Gateway 4, onto the roof of that stone building. That stone building is actually the old Maine Post Office, 1932. At the time of its completion, it was the largest post office in the world. Why did Chicago need such a big post office? Well, it used to be a major hub for mail order catalogs. If you ordered something from a Sears catalog back in the day, there's a good chance it was processed in this building. The post office moved to a smaller facility next door, and in 2016, its developers spent $900 million to turn this into corporate offices. They also turned the roof of this building into a 3-acre park called the Meadow. There are basketball courts up on that roof, walking trails, pickleball courts, even beekeepers, all on the roof of the old post office. Now you'll also notice there's an expressway that goes right underneath the post office, Ida B. Wells Drive or Congress Parkway. This is actually another feature of the Burnham plan. He said one day we're going to want a road right here, so when they built the post office in the late 1920s, they left a gap underneath, and then in the 50s they put the road right underneath it. Now this next stretch of the river heading south is story time. The story I'm going to tell you is called The 4 Stars of Chicago, or That Time We Accused a Cow of Arson. Now it's a long story, and to tell it, I need to take a long sip of water. The 4 Stars of Chicago, or That Time We Accused a Cow of Arson. We'll start with the Chicago flag. Here it is, we have a city flag, I'm holding it up. Let's talk about what the Chicago flag means. The 2 blue stripes on the Chicago flag represent the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. The 3 white sections represent the 3 sides of the city. The south side, the west side, and the north side. Of course, there is no east side of Chicago, because on the east side you have Lake Michigan. So if somebody ever tells you they're from the east side of Chicago, they might be a duck. That's the best that joke's done all day. I needed that bad. The 4 red stars represent significant moments in Chicago's history. It's the 4 F's. The fort, the fire, the fair, the fair. First star is the fort. Fort Dearborn, the original settlement from the early 1800s. That fort is no longer there, but I'll point out its original site later on. Second star is the fire. We got a time machine. Let's go there now. It's October 8, 1871. The city is dry. We have not had a drop of rain for 14 straight weeks. The city is also wooden. Some of our streets and sidewalks are even made of wood. The river back then was so polluted and oily, parts of the river itself were flammable. And to top it all off, on today, October 8, 1871, we have wind of up to 30 miles an hour. This is a bad combination. About 4 blocks to the right, or to the west of where we are right now, a fire breaks out in Miss Catherine O'Leary's barn. Quickly gets across the river and burns through 4 miles of the city north. Let's jump ahead about 30 hours to when the fire finally burns out. It has destroyed around 18,000 buildings. More than 100,000 people lost their homes. More than 300 people lost their lives. One of the biggest urban fires ever. It burned down about 1/3 of the city. Now, people want answers. Rumors are going around, because we know where the fire started, but we don't know how. The most popular rumor you find in a newspaper, they say there was a cow in the barn that kicked over a lantern and started the fire. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Chicago was the meatpacking capital of the world. Maybe some cow finally got grass fed up, decided to take matters into her own hooves and settle her beef once and for all. Yeah, I know the cow jokes are cheesy. I'll try not to milk it. Pretty good. I'd say on the whole, those work about 2% of the time. So, well, it's half and half. All right, let's skim ahead. We rebuild quickly. You may have heard Chicago's called the second city. That's because the first one burned down. It's basically our second attempt at building Chicago. Don't worry, I'm gonna get to that one on the way back. We rebuild so quickly that barely 20 years after the fire, we win a bid to host the World's Fair of 1893. That's your 3rd star on the Chicago flag, the fair. The World's Fair was a huge deal. At the time, the population of Chicago was around 1 million. That fair had 27 million visitors who saw things they had never seen before, including zippers were introduced at that World's Fair, spray paint, chocolate brownies, the dishwasher. One of the most impressive parts about the World's Fair was a campus down by the lake called the White City. 12 massive white buildings built by an all-star team of American architects. One of those buildings actually still stands today. It's now the Museum of Science and Industry. The World's Fair was overseen by an architect named Daniel Burnham. He did such a good job, they said, okay, Daniel, plan Chicago. So in the year 1909, we have the Burnham plan, a plan for the whole city. Its effects are still being felt today, including the Riverwalk and our lakefront. Years later, we'd host another World's Fair. Your fourth star on the Chicago flag. This one is impressive because it was our second time hosting a World's Fair. And also this one was in 1933, which is right in the middle of the Great Depression. But despite that, it was still so successful and profitable, they ran it for a second consecutive summer. Now, directly to the right, about 4 blocks to the right, there's a red and white cell tower. You might be able to see it through that fence. That cell tower 4 blocks to the right is the location of the Chicago Fire Academy. They built it in 1956, and to this day it's where Chicago trains firefighters. And that is also the exact former location of Miss Catherine O'Leary's barn, where the fire started, where we accused the cow of arson. That's now where we train firefighters. So, our captain's gonna do another U-turn, another great break to visit the bar or bathroom. My name is Michael. If you have any questions, one question I get a lot is, what is that? Ahead on the right with the 2 big smokestacks, that's an old steam plant. It's a power plant from the 1930s. It's been out of use since 2011, and it's not in great shape, so they want to tear it down. But it's in a tricky spot to demolish, because you got the river on this side and train tracks on the other side. And those Amtrak and Metro trains don't want to stop running to let them tear it down. So it's still kind of in limbo. They're negotiating that. It's one of our more endangered historic buildings. But as we turn, you can enjoy a look at one of our old power plants in the 1930s. Great time to get some pictures while I'm off the mic. My name is Michael. If you have any other questions, I'll be back on the mic after we turn around. We are back. A little follow-up on the fire. We'll never know for sure what started the Great Chicago Fire. Years later, on his deathbed, the newspaper editor who wrote the story about a cow kicking over a lantern admitted that he made it up. So it's probably not a cow that started the Great Chicago Fire. Our best theory is Miss Catherine O'Leary's neighbors were having a party that night. The theory is they snuck into her barn to steal some milk for the party and accidentally started the fire, which is just kind of a weird window into how they partied in the 1800s. Just chugging milk, I guess. On your right, this curving building is River City, 1986. Remember, Marina City, the corncob towers we talked about earlier? Same architect, Bertrand Goldberg. You can see the resemblance. Once again, a very rounded, natural design with no straight lines or sharp corners. And like Marina City, it is a multi-use building. Apartments above, daycare below, and underneath a marina to park your boats. River City's kind of shaped like a giant S. There's some advantages to that serpentine design. If you look at those balconies on the inside of that curve there, the way the building curves shelters them from the wind. You've probably heard Chicago's called the Windy City. That's partly because it is actually windy here, but the original reason we got that nickname is from when we were trying to get the World's Fair of 1893. New York also wanted the World's Fair. There was a rivalry going on. So when a New York Times writer heard our spokesman talking about how great Chicago is, he called them those windbags from that Windy City. It started as an insult. Now it's our whole brand. Now let's talk about what I call the royal family, the king, queen, and princess, the Chicago skyline. The king is directly ahead. The black skyscraper with the 2 big antenna is the Willis, formerly Sears Tower, the tallest building in Chicago. We'll talk about that long building at length, but first I want to talk about the building right in front of it. The big granite building with the blue crowns at the top is 311 South Wacker. I call it the queen because it's next to the king, because it kind of looks like a queen chess piece. Those blue crowns at the top are actually LED lights. Right around sunset, every night, those LED lights turn on bright white, and they realized those lights were so bright it was confusing migrating birds who thought that was the moon. So they worked with scientists to figure out what months of the year birds are mostly migrating through, and during that time they do a dimmer version of the lights on top of 311 South Wacker, so you don't have confused birds whacking into the building. For the princess, scan the horizon over to the right till you see a pointy roof with a gray statue sticking out of the top. See that gray statue on the horizon? That is the Chicago Board of Trade building, 1930. That was the tallest building in Chicago from 1930 until 1965. The gray statue on top is Ceres, Roman goddess of agriculture and grain, so we get the word cereal, or cerveza. The reason the Roman goddess of agriculture is on top of that building is because that's where we used to trade agricultural futures. If you're buying or selling stocks, various crops and livestock, all that stock trading happened right there in the Chicago Board of Trade. It's another Art Deco building from the end of the Roaring 20s, made of that same material, polished Indiana limestone. And if you've seen the movie Batman Begins, it was Wayne Enterprises. A lot of inspiration for Gotham City right here in Chicago. And now, the king. The Willis, formerly Sears Tower, the black skyscraper straight ahead with the 2 big antenna, is the tallest building in Chicago. And when it was completed in 1974, that was the tallest building in the world. It was the tallest building in the world for 24 years until 1998. How tall is it? 1,451 feet, or 442 meters, 110 floors. Still the tallest building in Chicago. Today it is the third tallest building in the United States. The second tallest building in America today is the Central Park Tower in New York. And the tallest building in the United States of America today is the One World Trade Center in New York. However, if you were to put the One World Trade Center side by side with the Willis Tower, roof to roof, the Willis Tower is actually 83 feet taller. However, you see those antennae on top of Willis Tower? Those communication antennae are not considered structural, so they do not count towards the official height. Whereas the One World Trade Center in New York has a very tall spire that does count towards the height, so they got us on a technicality. Well played, New York. That decision about what counts towards the official height was made by a real governing body called the Council of Tall Buildings. I just think that's a funny name. Now when you are the tallest building in the Windy City, you gotta deal with a lot of wind. On a very windy day, the top of the Willis Tower can sway up to 18 inches in any direction. Here's when we talk about our third method of sway reduction, how we calm down skyscrapers swaying in the breeze. The Willis Tower uses a method called bundled tubes. Look at the shape of the Willis Tower. It's essentially 9 towers, or tubes, grouped together. As you work your way up the building, fewer and fewer of those tubes continue. Only 2 of the tubes go to the building's full height, so they can lean together, resist the wind from any direction. The Burj Khalifa, tallest building in the world, uses a similar principle. The story behind this design, the building's lead architect was having dinner with its chief engineer, Fazlur Khan, in the 1970s, and there were cigarettes on the table. They realized if you stacked the cigarettes end to end, they were weaker. But if you bundled them together at the base, they were stronger. And so you get the Sears Tower, a building based on cigarettes. Let's talk about the name. I've called it the Sears Tower, I've called it the Willis Tower. It was originally built as the Sears Tower. It had that name for many years until the lease on the naming rights expired around the time of the '08 crash and was won by Willis, an insurance brokerage company that occupies 3 floors out of the 110 floors today. Most Chicago locals still call it the Sears Tower out of nostalgia. I call it the Sears Tower because I'm not from here and I'm just trying to fit in. Did you know 2 people have actually climbed the Sears Tower? First was in 1980. A local man named Dan Goodwin climbed it with suction cups while wearing a homemade Spider-Man costume. They called him Spider Dan. Underrated part about that for me, homemade Spider-Man costume. Dude could sew. Second person to climb the Sears Tower was in 1999. A Frenchman named Alain Robert climbed the Sears Tower in 1 hour and 20 minutes with no equipment. No ropes, no nothing. He just wedged his hands into the window frames and free climbed the whole thing. I know. I said that on a tour a few weeks ago and a kid near the front said, "Did he die?" That's a good question. He did not. He survived. He's climbed many of the other tallest buildings, including the Burj Khalifa. It's actually still active today. If you would like to visit the top of the Willis Tower, might I recommend the elevators. You can buy tickets. It's like somewhere $35, $45 for adults. You can actually see part of the observation deck. It's called Sky Deck. See those 5 glass boxes poking out of the side? See the people moving around in there? That's called the ledge. If you want to, you can walk out into one of those glass floored boxes and look straight down between your feet, over 1,000 feet straight down. Through the gap to your right, see the full height of the Willis Tower. They say on a clear day from the top of the Willis Tower, you can actually see 4 states: Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Now, obviously, you can't see exactly where those state borders are, so I'll help you out. If you see corn, that's Indiana. If you see a cow, that's Wisconsin. If you see somebody drinking a craft beer and resenting Ohio for no reason, that's Michigan. That's pretty regional. That doesn't always work. We were talking about the antenna on top of Willis Tower. They're communication antenna for radio, cell tower, that kind of thing. Now, those antennae might not have looked that tall. It's really just because they're so far away. You know, they're over 1,000 feet off the ground. It's a matter of perspective. To give you a frame of reference, the antenna on top of Sears Willis Tower are about the same height as Gateway 1 and 2, these black box buildings on your left. That's how tall the antenna are on top of Willis Tower, about 280 feet. Underneath the building to your left, there's the train tracks I was talking about earlier. You can hear the announcements from the train station. I've taken that train before. You can't understand a word they're saying. It's like... Now, all these buildings on the left that sit above those train tracks actually rent the air from the train companies. Technically, Amtrak and Metra own all the air directly above their train tracks, so these buildings pay rent to just exist in that air. It's called air rights. Now up in the air to your right, we're gonna look at the corners, these next two brown towers on your right. Notice how the corners are kind of jagged or serrated. Well, this is an office building. The most popular type of office is the corner office. So they made more corners. Every floor of both these two towers has 16 corner offices, with a lovely view of the other corner offices. This is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange from 1983. It's a big stock trading building. It used to trade stocks using hand signals, what's called line of sight trading. Today that's all done with computers. And as you can see, they have a nice riverfront patio. The goal for the city is to make as much of the river walkable as possible. It's going to be tough to do because a lot of our older buildings don't leave any space beside the river. That's because the way we use the river has changed over time. Today it's more recreational, tourism, and dining. But back in the day, we thought of the river more like a back alley for sewage and shipping. So a lot of our older buildings had their back turned on the river. A great example of that is this next huge stone building on your right from 1929, the Civic Opera Building. Another Art Deco building from the end of the roaring 20s. It's first opened 2 weeks after the great stock market crash. See the inscription on the wall? You may notice it appears to say Civic Opera Building. That's not a typo, they just use the Latin alphabet to be more fancy. There is no letter U in that alphabet, so they use a V instead, still pronounced building. This huge flat section where there's no windows, the reason there's no windows is that's the back of the stage. They have the largest stage in downtown Chicago. It's the second largest opera auditorium in America, seats 3,600 people. Chicago has a lot of great downtown theater. We're also famous for our comedy scene. Improv was invented here. If you've ever seen shows like Whose Lines Is It Anyway? And a lot of the famous comedians you know today got their start here in theaters like the Second City. You know, Bill Murray, Tina Fey, Michael Ribbons. That's me. All got their start right here in Chicago. If you need recommendations for a comedy show, just ask me during a break. Tons of funny shows here in Chicago, any night of the week. On your left, you got a long glass rectangle that then goes straight up. The Boeing Building, 1990. Now this one was actually originally built for the Morton Salt Company. It was built for a salt company, so if you look way up on the roof, there's a big gray panel. They put 6 holes into it to make the building look like a giant salt shaker. Speaking of salt, let's talk about Chicago food. Does anyone have a guess? Help me out, shout it out. What is the most famous Chicago food? Deep dish pizza, that's right, deep dish pizza. Smart boat, well done. Personally, my favorite place for deep dish is called La Briola. If you need me to spell it, just ask during the break. And we have a guess. What is the second most famous Chicago food? Hot dogs. That's right, a Chicago style hot dog. Does anyone know the one thing you do not get on a Chicago dog?
Mustard.
Ketchup, that's right. Smart boat, well done, A+. It's a big point of civic pride for us, not having ketchup on our hot dogs. If you ask for ketchup on a Chicago dog, that is a felony. We will throw you in the lake. I'm just kidding, I'm from Virginia. I really don't care what you put in your hot dog. Third most famous Chicago food, probably an Italian beef sandwich. I'd recommend Al's or Portillo's for Italian beef. The next brick building on the right is the Great Lakes Building, 1910. Now if we took our time machine back between, say, 1910 and 1920, this is what a lot of the buildings on the river would have looked like. These wide brick warehouses from the early shipping and manufacturing days of the city. The building that was here before this, in the same spot, there used to be an old wooden gathering hall called the Wigwam, which hosted the first Republican National Convention, which is where Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president. This is the spot on Earth where Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president. So we are back at Wolf Point, the junction of the 3 branches of the Chicago River. We're leaving the south branch, we're going to hang a right on the main branch. We'll start heading east in the direction of Lake Michigan. Ahead on your right, this lovely patch of grass is actually the end of the official Riverwalk. The Riverwalk goes all the way from here out to Navy Pier, where we started the tour. And right behind this patch of grass, on your right, this curving blue glass skyscraper is the New Building, 1983, a great early example of contextualism. In this case, the way the front of the building curves once again imitates the curve of the river, and the 2 alternating colors of blue glass imitate the river and the sky. Also, you seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off? That was Ferris's dad's office. He looks out of that building, sees Ferris Bueller in the parade. Straight ahead, that huge stone building is the Merchandise Mart we talked about earlier. The Merchandise Mart is gigantic. When it was completed in 1929, that was the largest commercial building in the world, and it held that title until they built the Pentagon. There are over 73 American football fields worth of office space in that building, 4.2 million square feet, 7 miles of hallways. There are 10 kilometers of hallways, all within the Merchandise Mart. It was originally a department warehouse. It's not where you would go to buy a couch, it's where your department store would go to buy, say, 5,000 couches. The Merchandise Mart is so big, it used to have its own zip code, its own postal code that just meant that building, the Merchandise Mart. We talked about how this Art Deco style was all about optimism and what we could do with machines. But I wondered if they could have ever imagined we would one day have the technology to use the whole 2.5-acre front face of that building as a giant projector screen. It's called Art on the Mart. It's a free show they do every night. They project art videos across the river, cover the whole front face of the Merchandise Mart. It is the world's largest projected public art display, and it's free every night. I believe their show times are 8:30 and 9 p.m. You can double check their website, Art on the Mart. They play music with it as well. It's truly one of a kind. I highly recommend Art on the Mart. We're back on the main branch of the Chicago River. The best place to watch Art on the Mart is a section of the Riverwalk coming up on your right. Once we get past the bridge here, you actually be able to see the projectors I was talking about. Look for the big gray box at eye level on the wall to your right. Those are the projectors for Art on the Mart. Those projectors cost around $8 million. They're actually perfectly calibrated to shine everywhere except for the windows. This is still an office building, and if you're working late, you don't want to get, blinded by like 1/200th of an image of a duck or whatever. This section of the Riverwalk on our right is called the jetty. There's stainless steel poles poking out of those green garden beds. Those garden beds in the water right there are called fish hotels. The idea is their roots hang down into the water and encourage marine life. Fish. As recently as the 1970s, there were only 10 species of fish that could survive in the Chicago River. Today there are over 70 species of fish in the Chicago River. It's gotten a lot cleaner. Partially due to cleanup efforts by organizations like Friends of the Chicago River, but also due to the fact a lot of factories have moved elsewhere. Today it's more apartment and office buildings on the river, which don't put as much junk into the water. It is a long-term goal for the city to make the river clean enough to swim in. We are not there yet. You can swim in Lake Michigan. I would not swim in the Chicago River. Give it maybe 25 years. Now this next stretch of the river up ahead on your right is actually the site of one of our greatest tragedies. So after the Titanic sank in 1912, there was a lifeboats for all movement. They wanted to make sure every boat had enough lifeboats. So a few years later, in 1915, there was a steamboat called the Eastland that was tied up about a block ahead to our right. And they were designed to hold 6 lifeboats, but because of that movement, they now had 11 lifeboats. And they stored them on the top deck. It was already a poorly designed top-heavy boat, and those extra life-saving equipment, ironically on the top deck, actually made the whole boat roll over. Well, there was over 2,000 people on it for a company outing. It was chaotic. People were diving in the river to help pull people out. One account said there was a man by the river who was contemplating suicide. He actually jumped in the water and started saving lives. They actually turned this brick building on your left, the Reed Murdoch Center from 1914, into a makeshift hospital. In the end, 844 passengers died. That's more passengers than died in the Titanic. It is the worst shipwreck in Great Lakes history. It happened right here in downtown Chicago, what's called the Eastland disaster of 1915. It happened right here on your right. Now, oddly enough, it had ripple effects in the history of Chicago's sports as well. There was a 20-year-old man named George Hallis who was supposed to be on the Eastland, but he was late and he missed it. He would later go on to found the Chicago Bears, our NFL football team. Earlier I mentioned the Chicago Cubs, one of our Major League Baseball teams. They play on the north side of historic Wrigley Field. That's another great tour if you get a chance. My roommate is actually a tour guide at Wrigley Field. So if you take a tour of Wrigley Field and your tour guide is a guy with a red beard named James, tip him well. He's the reason I have Disney+. Like I said, this brick building on your left is the Reed Murdoch Center from 1914. It's another great example of at that time, the 19-teens, we had a lot of these wide brick warehouses from the early shipping and manufacturing days of the city. Today, among other things, the Reed Murdoch Center is the headquarters for Encyclopedia Britannica. It actually got bought out a few years ago. It's now an American company. Those are the headquarters for Encyclopedia Britannica. On the right, we talk about 55 West Wacker, the concrete building with the gold 5.5. Let's go one to the left of that. That black and gray Minecraft-looking building is the Leo Burnett 1989. If you're a fan of the show Mad Men, the show is probably based on the advertising firm that works in there. Leo Burnett created many beloved advertising characters, including the Jolly Green Giant, Toucan Sam, Pillsbury Doughboy, and Tony the Tiger. All created by the company that works right in there. About 1/3 of the way up, you see that dark belt where it looks different on the corners? Once again, the height is no coincidence. It's the same height as the roof, 55 West Wagon to the right. That's 1989, saying hello to 1968. We got skyscrapers waving hello to each other all across the city, across time. Time. Straight ahead, a little bit to the right, look for vertical white letters that say Morton's The Steakhouse. If you go straight up from there, you're going to see a narrow green tower with a shiny golden tip. That golden tip building is one of my favorite pictures on the tour. It's the Carbide and Carbon building, 1929. You see it? Nice. Designed by the Burnham brothers, the sons of Daniel Burnham. Now, 1929 was right in the middle of Prohibition, the period of American history where it was against the law to produce or distribute alcohol. Prohibition was not very popular here in Chicago. In fact, right in the middle of Prohibition, in a little subtle act of silent protest, we built a giant champagne bottle. See how it's green just like a bottle? And the gold near the top looks like the foil on a bottle of champagne. That is real gold up there. Very thin, even thinner than saran wrap. Now, one consequence of the Chicago fire is we got a clean slate to redesign our city grid. When we did that, we spaced out our downtown. So a lot of our downtown skyscrapers have more room to breathe than in other cities that did not have the luxury of burning to the ground. Rare exception to that rule is this cluster of 4 buildings straight ahead on the right. See how those 4 buildings are all squeezed in together, side by side? It's actually pretty rare in downtown Chicago to have skyscrapers that close together. Second from the right, that skinny stone rocket ship-shaped building is the Mather Tower, 1928. It's actually the same height as the second setback on Trump Tower. On the left side of the river, that second black strip on Trump Tower is acknowledging its predecessor. The Mather Tower is the skinniest skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The top floor of that building is just 9 feet across. See the white cap at the very top? It's a different color. That was actually replaced in the early 2000s. They built the replacement off-site, floated it down the river on a barge, and then flew that whole white cap up there via helicopter. Straight ahead on the left, remember that white clock tower, the Wrigley building? We were talking about how it's an office building made to look like a cathedral. Well, the same is true for the building just to the right of that. Straight ahead, see those white letters that say Chicago Tribune on the Tribune Tower, 1925. In this case, it was the offices of a newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, but it's modeled after the Rouen Cathedral in France, a style called French Gothic Revival. The most famous example of Gothic architecture would be the Cathedral Notre Dame. Similar design here, but on a building for a newspaper. The Tribune Tower is actually originally the result of a contest. Back in the day, the owner of the newspaper offered $100,000 in prizes for someone to design the world's most beautiful office building, won by New York architects Howells and Hood. Near the top of the Tribune Tower, you'll see skinny stone towers connected by arches. Those are purely decorative. There's nothing in those stone towers. They're called flying buttresses, a feature of Gothic architecture. The newspaper moved out of the building in 2018. Today it is high-end apartments. But it's what's called a landmark building, which means they legally cannot change the outside of the building unless it is to restore it, because it's such a historic part of our skyline. The Tribune Tower also has a collection of rare materials from famous landmarks, such as the Great Wall of China, Pyramids of Giza, and the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It's the style on which it is based. And in between the Tribune Tower and Wrigley Building, another quick glimpse of the Intercontinental Hotel with its round yellow dome and blimp parking spot. This street right here is Michigan Avenue, what's called the Magnificent Mile. A lot of famous shops and restaurants along here. About 10 minutes that way is the world's largest Starbucks. And about 10 minutes that way is Millennium Park with the famous Bean. Now the bridge has been renamed Du Sable Bridge. That's in honor of an explorer from Haiti named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He was the first non-native settler to set up a trading post here in Chicago. He was married to a native woman named Kitikawa, and she helped him set up trade relationships with the local Native Americans. And they set up that original trading post right over there, where the Apple Store is today. That glass building is the Apple Store from 2017, and sits roughly on the site. The first non-native settler set up a trading post. The Apple Store, the roof looks a lot like a MacBook, and also that glass around the outside, they had to make it darker because originally birds could not see it. Talk about angry birds. Also, Fort Dearborn, the first star on the Chicago flag, was right around this area as well. If you're walking on Michigan Avenue, there's plaques in the sidewalk that show the outline of that original fort. Now, the reason that that street is called Michigan Avenue is because it's roughly the original edge of Lake Michigan. Most of the land you see in front of you is actually man-made. It sits on landfill. And some of that landfill is even rubble from the Great Chicago Fire. When 18,000 buildings got destroyed, it's a lot of raw material. We just pushed it out onto the lake and made more land. Now, through this next gap on your left, see the one that says Fidelity? Just through this next gap on your left, you're going to get a quick glimpse of the John Hancock Center. Look for the black skyscraper off in the distance through the gap to your left. It's got 2 giant antennae. I can see the John Hancock Center now. You're about to be able to see it. Off to your left, that black skyscraper is the John Hancock Center. When it was completed in 1969, it was the tallest building in Chicago, and at the time it had the deepest foundation of any building in the world. Still the deepest foundation in Chicago. It's the 5th tallest building in Chicago. And it actually sits on the site of a shipwreck. Back in 1886, a man named George Streeter ran his steamboat aground on a sandbar 400 feet offshore. It was there so long that over time, construction debris and trash started to fill in the area between the boat and the shore, eventually creating 186 acres of brand new prime real estate. The location was prime. The land itself was literally garbage. Now, George Streeter actually declared it his very own district of Michigan, and he started illegally selling plots of land to people, and soon it was a full-blown shantytown. He fought local authorities for years to keep his district of Michigan in both court and with force. One time police came to evict him, and his wife dumped a pot of boiling water on him. Although he eventually lost his battle, today this neighborhood to our left is called Streeterville in his honor. And what was once a shanty town on a pile of trash is now one of the fanciest neighborhoods in Chicago. They have the Ritz-Carlton, some of the only 5-star hotels in the Midwest, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and like I said, the John Hancock Center, 5th tallest building in Chicago. You get to see the observation deck of the John Hancock Center. It's called 360. Amazing view, especially of Lake Michigan during the daytime. Now, I know in this tour I've thrown a lot of information at you. I know it's a lot to take in. So what I want to do to wrap things up is give you a chronological time lapse of the entire history of Chicago's architecture in 2 minutes. Ready? Here we go. I'm back in the time machine. We hit rewind.
Pues eso fue el paseo arquitectónico que nos dimos, dura 75 minutos. Fue muy interesante toda la arquitectura que tiene esta ciudad desde 1920 hasta la actualidad. Estuvieron explicando, pues obviamente la explicación en inglés, hay explicaciones en español. Luego te recomiendo que sí, que veas el recorrido arquitectónico que te ofrece aquí Chicago en esta área del Navy Pier. Pues bueno, seguimos aquí en Chicago recorriendo estos espacios de aquí de Navy Pier.